look back a little bit now this evening. Anglican missionary Father Michael Lapsley was active in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He lost his hands and sight in one of his eyes. He, after receiving a letter bomb from a covert organization of the regime's security apparatus. Father Michael, who is the founder of the Institute for Healing of Memories, joins us now for a conversation. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time, Father Lapsley, for coming on tonight here on In Focus. As we were planning and preparing for this conversation, I listened to one of the conversations you had a long time ago as you were coming into the country. You said one of the things that were in your mind is that you were not prepared for what you were about to see in South Africa. In fact, your expectation was that you were going to find three types of people: those who were oppressed, and those who were the oppressors, and those who were fighting for either side of that representation. How has your view of South Africa changed since then?
Thank you, Thabo, and good evening to the viewers. I suppose when I first arrived in South Africa, I had a lot of head knowledge. I'd read a lot about South Africa, but that did not prepare me for the experience of being a white man in South Africa. I often say that the day I arrived in South Africa, I stopped being a human being and I became a white man. So for me, joining the liberation struggle was about the journey to recover my own humanity in solidarity with black people struggling for their own basic human rights. But I had no recognition just to what degree I would be traumatized by the experience of living in this oppressive state. And of course, the other terrible dimension was that apartheid was carried out in the name of the Christian gospel. So my faith was abused to justify racism and oppression.
And how was being a national chaplain for Anglican students, both black and white, how did that, I suppose, help you discover your humanity?
Well, you know, in 1976, there was, or even the Christian organizations had split on racial lines. And the last Christian organization in which we were all together, black and white, was the Anglican Student Federation. And I think it helped us to see that we were all oppressed in a way, that those of us who are white benefited from the system, but that doesn't spell liberation, just as all black people suffered under apartheid. So I think many of us were motivated to actually create a society in which we could truly be sisters and brothers in a decent society. So I think that was the experience that we had in those days. And of course, it was a time when young white boys were having to go to the army to defend apartheid, where so many black people were detained, imprisoned, killed, tortured. So it was a terrible reality. I mean, I became national chaplain in July of 1976 at the time of the Soweto uprising.
Yeah, 33 years now since you received that letter bomb and that incident that really changed your life in such a pivotal way. When you were faced now with that level of injustice directed at you, did it change in any way your view and the side that you had picked as far as fighting for justice?
Well, no, thank you, Thabo. I'm laughing because often journalists say, "Father, you received a letter bomb. Did it affect you?" Yes. Surprise, surprise. Obviously, anything which is life-threatening will be life-changing, will either cause us to diminish and to grow. But a key part of my healing was that for 14 years before the bomb went off, I lived in the countries of South Africa, Lesotho and Zimbabwe, but I traveled the world as part of the struggle against apartheid. And so when I received this letter bomb, there were messages of prayer, love, and support from across the world, from Christians, from Muslims, from Jews, from Hindus, from atheists, from communists. So I was accompanied on my journey of healing. And I realized that if I was filled with hatred, bitterness, self-pity, desire for revenge, that I would be a victim forever. They would have failed to kill the body, but they would have killed the soul. So with that accompaniment And speaking from a perspective of faith, God enabled me to travel a journey from being a victim, which I was, something terrible had happened to me. I was a survivor because I was still alive. But to take the step of victory, to take the step of, if you like, recovering agency and seeing, and in a way, subsequently I started an institute for healing of memories with other colleagues. And so I began to see that we need to heal emotionally, psychologically, spiritually in order to be able to create a just society, to work with justice. And by justice, I mean restorative justice, transformative justice, a society in which there is what we haven't got in South Africa, equality, justice, and dignity for all.
Yeah. So when we talk about this reparation, justice, and dignity for all, one can help and always go back to the TRC process and the debates today around reparations and why the TRC crimes have not been investigated and why we are still seeing those families not being properly compensated for the suffering that they've gone through. What is your view on how that process was handled and how that process is being handled today?
Well, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was a whole volume of their recommendations, but a key recommendation was that more than 100 cases were referred to the state and specifically to the National Prosecuting Authority to prosecute. And it's a source of shame to the ANC government and to the people of South Africa as a whole that 30 years on, those people still haven't received any kind of accountability. Those who were the perpetrators and who fulfilled the conditions received amnesty for what they had received, while these families still await. And it's a travesty of injustice, and it's an insult to those who died, who sacrificed for so much. It's inexcusable, and is a blot on our democracy. And I'm surprised that even today there's a snail's pace at which those cases are being investigated. Where now many of the perpetrators have died, but the families still wait for that accountability.
And would you, as a process, suggest and recommend other countries in the world to follow a TRC type process in terms of finding their route towards reconciliation and healing?
Well, I think that's one of the very interesting things, that South Africa's model was seen as an example. The countries that were seeking to provide a transition away from dictatorship, away from years of oppression towards a democratic order, could use as a way of saying we won't seek to bury and to forget the past, but we will seek to remember and to heal. Interesting, one of the best examples, a country that I know quite well, the little tiny country of Timor-Leste, in the Pacific, where something like 20% of the population died under Indonesian rule. So they had a process like we did, but not only that, they set up a structure, and I'm actually on the advisory board of that structure, to implement the recommendations of the Commission. Now, what happened in our case, it was taken over by the state, and you see, our TRC didn't fail. It was the democratic state that failed to implement the recommendations, which is why now many relatives of victims are still frustrated and bitter. In some ways, some countries probably took on what we did uncritically and didn't see the shortfalls of it. But I suppose a positive aspect is the recognition that you can't simply bury the past. It has to be dealt with. Otherwise, it has wounds that will infect the society, the body politic, in every way.
Good point to end our conversation tonight. Father Lapsley, I appreciate you, and thank you very much for coming on and for this reflection with us here this evening.